to study, to hear your word preached, to pray, to sing. We're thankful for the ones who have joined us physically. We're thankful for those who have joined us electronically. And we know that some of our physical family, some of our church family are ill that are not here. We ask that you attend to their needs. And we also know some are traveling. We ask that you give them traveling protection and grace. We ask now that you guide our thinking, guide our discussion as we address another portion of your scriptures. And we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So let me welcome you to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, Louisiana, on the, what is today, fourth day of January 2026. So we've got a new year, and we're going to start a new chapter. And as Casey and I were talking about before we went on the air, much of it is repetitive. So we're gonna begin to look at chapter 9. I'm gonna have verses 1 through 5. That's the only 5 verses we're going to look at. But before we dig into the text, I want to key on one of the words in verse 1 of chapter 9. Paul says that it's superfluous. Did I say that right? Superfluous for him to continue to write about this. So it almost seems as if he realizes that he's already covered this multiple times. But if we begin to think about superfluous as being unnecessary or not useful, to put it in that frame, we might begin to think about, because this has been covered so much and in so many different places, we might begin to think about, are there questions about this text that we have not thought about? And particularly about the gift that they're collecting. And that led me to thinking about context. Now we talk here a lot about context. We've heard the saying that text without context is pretext. We've also talked a lot about the rule of context. What is the rule of context? Context rules. Now we say that kind of automatically. What does that mean? What does the rule of context mean?
That means whatever is said or written, it's important to know why it was.
Okay.
If I stand up and say, oh, great, man, if I'm trying to say something derogatory, that may just be sarcasm. Or I might be saying, oh, great, they're really celebrating. So it's the context of the oh, great.
Yeah. It goes to why. It goes to how. It goes to the greater frame of what this verse is about. So rule of context actually means that which goes with whatever it is we're studying. We also know that there are generally 3 kinds of context. There's the immediate, that's whatever we're looking at specifically, usually a portion of text. It's the intermediate, which is usually the pericope in which the verse is found. And then we have the far or the general, which in the case of the material we're studying includes the entire book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And we've been at this for how many years? When did we start 1 Corinthians? Anybody remember? Okay, 23. So with 26, that's going on 3 years. And we've been in 2 Corinthians for a year and a half, 2 years. So we've got a lot of general context that affects, and I use that in quotes, that affects the immediate verses we've been looking at in 2 Corinthians, primarily chapter 8. We'll come back to that. But so that poses a couple of questions. Paul is talking in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, but he's writing specifically to the church at Corinth. And a part of what he's writing about is this collection that is going to Jerusalem. Now, if we're thinking contextually, is the church at Corinth the first or the only church that Paul addresses this to? What do you think? What say you? Remember now, we've been looking at this for nearly 3 years, so the church at Corinth must be important. Is it the only one? And the answer is, I don't know. Okay, so we're going to find out. Put on your Bible. What used to be the Bible drill, but put on your Bible drill hat, because we're going to run some cross references. We typically don't do this, but we're going to look at several cross references. We're going to start in Acts chapter 11. So get out your phones or your hard copies. I see 1 or 2 hard copies. I see 1 or 2 phones, so whatever. Go to Acts chapter 11. We're going to begin in verse 25, and we're going to look at 25 through 30. Now, we're not going to unpack this per se, but we're looking at specific pieces of information that helps us fill in this general context that we're looking at, okay? So verse 25. So Barnabas went to Tarsus and looked for Saul. Saul being who? Later becomes Paul. Okay. 26. And when he found him, Paul, he brought him, Paul, to Antioch. For a whole year they met with the church, taught a great many people. In Antioch, the disciples were first to be called Christian. Now in those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem. Now let me stop there. Antioch is north of Jerusalem. So why does the text say they came down from Jerusalem? This is contextual, remember?
City on a hill.
Okay. It was known as a city on a hill. Anything else? Think contextually.
I think from an authority standpoint.
Okay, has to do with authority. It has to do with the way these texts are written. The New Testament texts are written in the view that Jerusalem is the center of the world. And it is on a hill, so it's not geographic that they come down from Jerusalem and go up to, in this case, Antioch. So. Okay, going back to verse 28, 27. In those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a what? Great famine. Now, put that in your memory because that's important. All over the world, this took place in the days of Claudius, and we're going to come back to Claudius later. So the disciples determined everyone according to his ability to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, which is the thing we've been talking about all these months. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So it would seem that this is the first reference to this offering being collected. And the church mentioned there is Antioch, not Corinth, Antioch. So it seems that the first effort to send this relief to Jerusalem, although this one was not directly through the impetus of Paul, was from the church at Antioch. The relief sent to Judea during the famine is the earliest instance of, and this is important, Gentile support coming to the Jews from, or to the Jewish converts from the church at Antioch. Okay? So we've got a reference to at least to one church. Now, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. You have to put on your memory cap here because it's been a while since we looked at 1 Corinthians. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2. We're there? Some of us? Okay. This is Paul writing, obviously, Paul speaking. He said, now concerning the collection for the saints, which is the thing we've been talking about, as I directed the churches of Galatia, actually, so you were all to do also. So we've got a mention of another church or another geographic area. So Paul is saying here, do as I directed the church in Galatia. So this is telling us that he had instructed this church prior to instructing the church at Corinth. Okay? So we're developing a timeline. Now I will tell you it is not precise, but it does give us information that there are at least two churches that are mentioned prior to the church at Corinth. Galatia, there's no S in it, but I can't pronounce it without the S, so, was a central province in Central Asia Minor. It included the towns of Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Poseidon. And we've heard those names before as well. So. And these are churches, or these are cities, these are areas that Paul visited on his first missionary journey. Okay? So we've got Antioch, we've got Galatia, we've got at least two. Now let's go to 2 Corinthians. Rudy is very familiar with this one. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And we're going to look generally at verses 1 through 4. Paul says, I want you who, remember who's he writing to? Corinth. But brothers, by the grace of God, that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. So we've got a third reference. Antioch, Galatia, Macedonia. And I'm not going to pursue that because we spent several weeks doing that previously. So, okay, Romans 15. Told you we're going to do Bible drill. Go to Romans 15, verse 26. And we have another reference. Paul says, for Macedonia and Achaia. So we have a fourth reference. Now we're going to come back to Achaia later. But they have been pleased to make this contribution. Notice to whom or what specifically? The poor among the saints. That's important. We'll come back to that later as well. So now we've got, what, four references? Antioch. What was the second one? Galatia. Macedonia. And Achaia. Or again, there's no S. It's actually Achaia, but it's pronounced Acacia. So, isn't that cool? Isn't it neat how the Greek screws stuff up? So, okay, so we've got at least four references of 4 areas or 4 churches that possibly, now we can't do a definitive timeline, but it's possible that he had approached these churches prior to approaching the church at Corinth. So that would answer our question, was Corinth first? And the probability is that it wasn't. So, remember, we're thinking contextually. We're trying to put some frames around this piece of text so we have a better understanding. So, now, this presents us with perhaps another question. Now, this is one that Rudy had addressed several weeks ago. Why was this collection necessary? That's not rhetorical. Why was the collection necessary? We've already had a hint in one of our references. Anybody? I'm not particular.
There was a famine.
Yeah, we've seen a reference to a famine.
Famine and overcrowding.
Okay.
Not enough food, too much.
Yeah, we'll get to that one in a minute. There's another specific reference. Remember, it was a collection for the poor in Jerusalem. So this collection was for material support in Jerusalem. It was Paul initiated this because these are Jewish believers were experiencing severe poverty and hardship due to famine, economic decline, and social marginalization. And we're gonna detail those out a little bit. As I just said, in Romans 15, we saw that this collection, this contribution, was specifically for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. So this tells us that we can know that the Jerusalem church was struggling financially. Many of the Christians in Jerusalem were poor. The city itself faced economic decline because it's under Roman rule. Now, we're not going to chase that too far, but the Romans weren't particularly interested in the local communities being successful. Rome was interested in collecting their taxes, and we know how all that plays out. So.
For the pettiness of the Jews, I mean, we have the Jewish converts to Christianity. They just didn't want to do business with them. They wanted to make sure that they were, not only ostracized, religiously, but ostracized financially.
Economically, yes.
Yeah, they wanted to, make sure, hey, you come back to us, look at all the power we have and all the ability that you have to make money and feed your family, or you can starve.
Yeah. And we had another reference, this was in Acts 11, where it says, it talks specifically about a famine, a worldwide famine. And we can know from some scriptural references that this hit Judea particularly hard. So we've got that specific reference to a famine, which would have created food shortages, and we'll see that played out again in a minute. So we see that the Acts passage tells us there's a severe famine that's occurring during the rule of Claudius. Now, if we're doing this inductively, we would want to know who Claudius was. It's not particularly important, but Claudius was the fourth emperor of Rome, and he reigned from AD 41 to 54. Now that gives us a specific time frame that we can peg this to. if we wanted to do any other historical look at, about what's going on here. Okay, we also know that the persecution and social marginalization had an effect here. The Jewish Christians in Jerusalem were often ostracized by both the Jews and the Romans. So this condition likely worsened their economic situation as they had fewer opportunities for trade, employment, and social support. So we've got food shortages, we've got a famine, and now we've got all of this other social stuff that's contributing to their being poor, to their social and economic conditions. Now we want to look at, you don't have to go there, I'm going to read this one. We want to go to Acts 6, verse 1. Let me read this. It said, now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, remember that's important, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. Now there's several things in here that are important to the context that we're trying to establish. We're not going to unpack this specifically other than to look at these facts. In these days probably refers to the activities of the apostles as after Pentecost, when they were preaching and they were extensively adding to the membership of the church in Jerusalem. This is a church who is already struggling financially. It's a church in a social situation that's depleted. So it's, in a sense, it's a perfect storm. You've got a struggling church that's adding multiple people that it's responsible for. So the disciples are preaching, they're adding. The results of this activity is the membership of the church is growing exponentially. And you can see that a couple of ways. That may be a good thing, but economically and socially it may be a difficulty. Remember, we're trying to establish some reasons why Paul is going around all of Asia Minor doing these collections. And it's based on what's going on in Jerusalem. Okay, back to the Acts 6 passage. There was a complaint from the Greek-speaking Jews. So we know from the Pentecost account, this is in Acts 2, that people came from basically all over the known world at that point. They came from all over the dispersion. They came to Jerusalem. It is suspected that many of them were old and that they wanted to spend the rest of their time in Jerusalem. Now, because they had formerly resided somewhere else, they spoke Greek. The Jews in Jerusalem typically spoke Aramaic or Hebrew. Before they were converted, the Greek-speaking Jews had their own synagogue. They had their own assemblies. The Aramaic or Hebraic Jews had their synagogue and their assemblies. So we have an innate separation and division based on linguistics and culture. Now, the overall concept of the church is one of unity, obviously, and that did exist. But we've still got these separate communities. Now, when a Jew converts, Remember, many of these folks have converted. They're now in the church. What are they not in? Where do they typically worship before?
They're not in any of the pagan synagogues.
In the synagogues. They are in the church. They're not in the synagogue, which somewhat, I'll say typically, was a source of not only religious activity, but is a source of economic and financial support. So the one support that they had outside of all the other stuff going on socially is no longer available. So it's another factor that contributes to this difficulty in the Jerusalem church. It's an increasing number of poor, elderly, dependent individuals. It makes sense why Paul's going all over Asia Minor collecting money.
Much like the martyrdom of all the apostles is a proof that what they thought was real was worth dying for, you have the same thing going on here in Jerusalem. They have their former connections with other Jews, and all they had to do was just give in, and they would be fed. All they had to do was go back to the old ways, and they'll be fed. And instead of them going on all the preacher comforts of being able to just they continue to preach and live the truth, even though that kept them financially destitute. It would be so easy for them to just give in, but they didn't.
Yeah, that's another theological factor that plays into this whole economic and social. Deviate here a little bit. It seems as if these folks were not willing to give up their Christian belief, even to get fed. Now, we don't know that from the Scripture, but that's the general sense of what this is about. So we've seen, we have some supporting information to support why Paul's going all around collecting this money, because of the conditions in Jerusalem. Is there possibly another reason he does this aside from the material means that he's going to send to Jerusalem? Can you think of any other reason why he may be doing this? Other than he likes to travel and he needs the points so he can fly? No. Okay. Now, Paul walked or he went on a ship mostly. Is there any other factor that may go into this? And again, the answer is, I don't know. Okay, let's see if we can find out. Go to Galatians chapter 2. So that's a hint. There is another reason. Actually, there's two other reasons. Galatians 2, verse 10. Again, this is Paul. And he's talking about the church in Rome. Verse 10, it says, only they, that's the leaders in the church, they ask us, that's Paul and company, to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Now, we're not going to unpack this verse either. However, we can begin to get some understanding of these other factors. So the only request that the leaders in Jerusalem made to Paul was that he remembered the poor, which he affirmed that he would do. And it's been his concern all along to bring financial relief to the church. And it was this belief, this concern, that motivated him in his third journey, missionary journey, to raise all of these funds, all of this money. Now, there's another point to this that's not specifically stated, but we have to kind of extrapolate this one. This offering would alleviate human suffering. I mean, we've established that. And it would also demonstrate genuine concern on the part of the Gentiles for the Jewish believers. So he's beginning to build a bridge between Gentiles and Gentile churches and Jewish converts in the church at Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem was, and to some degree is, the center of Jewish thought, culture, the whole ball of wax. So at this point, it was to some degree, still was. But Paul's going around to all these Gentiles. How did Jews typically view Gentiles? Yeah, not very kindly. How did Gentiles typically view Jews? Okay, not very kindly. So we'll leave it at that. So if he goes to a Gentile church and says, hey guys, I want to collect some money to send to Jewish converts in Jerusalem, what kind of response you think he's going to get? Not very positive. Until he starts to do some things we saw in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So he through his teaching, through his preaching, and this collection, he's beginning to build a bridge between these two cultures. So,
Think he's building a bridge, or is he just tearing down a fence? Because he stopped saying Jewish believers and just calls everybody believers. I think,
yeah, his language reflects that.
yeah, so we're all in one. In Galatians, man, that's when he really brings it down.
Yeah. Another thing we'll get to probably next week, there is only one place in all of his writings that he refers to Jerusalem. He refers to it in 1 Corinthians, but none of his other writings actually talk about Jerusalem. It's a collection for the, what? Saints. So he's modifying, I'm getting ahead of myself, but he's modifying his language even in how he writes. So,
Think of even the theological significance of the Jews that he lays out in Romans very clearly. I think that he's same thing, tearing down fences, building bridges.
Yeah.
You know, referring back to the grafting in of the vine and all of these things to
yeah,
build up unity between all believers.
yeah.
We're fast approaching it in upstairs in John when he really lays it out. You know, if you do not have Jesus, you do not have the Father. So we don't know who you're worshiping, but it's not the Father.
Paul must have been an enormously intelligent guy to be a tent maker. So as he builds this bridge, this would help to promote unity, but unity and love between these two ethnic groups, which are both believers. Now that kind of gets fuzzy in my head, but these are two very separate ethnic groups which are both believers, which on both sides are going to have to begin to learn some different things within this construct of the gospel and believing the gospel. That is an enormous shift. We could translate that into some of the modern missionary evangelical work, because they face those same kinds of tasks to make these shifts. So it's the other reason for this is to begin to build unity between Gentiles and Jewish Christians. And he saw this collection as a mechanism, as a means to begin to do that. Now there's one other there's one other possibility as why he's doing this. Now, frankly, I had never really thought about this one, so this one was new for me. Go to Romans. We're going to look at this one. Go to Romans 15. We're going to look again at verse 25, but we're going to go through verse 27. We've looked at these first two verses before, but we're going to go a little deeper. This is Romans chapter 25, chapter 15, verse 25 through 27. Paul says, "At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem to bring aid to the saints, for Macedonia and Achaia has been pleased to make some contribution for the poor." We've looked at that among the saints at Jerusalem. Oh, I'm sorry, I misquoted, because he does mention Jerusalem in Romans. Okay, my bad. Verse 27, and this is where we're going to park for a minute. "For they who?" Yeah, the Gentiles, we could parenthesis Gentiles, were pleased to do it. That's the contribution. And indeed, they, Gentiles, owe it to them. Them who? The Jewish converts in Jerusalem. "For if the Gentiles have come to share in their who? Jewish converts, spiritual blessing, they who? Gentiles, ought also to be of service to them, Jewish converts, in material blessings." Now, we're not going to unpack all of that, but what he's doing is he's tying spiritual blessing that the Gentiles, in a sense, got from the Jewish converts to this material support that he's going around collecting. So the churches in Asia Minor contributed to this offering, and he mentions Macedonia and Achaia. And he emphasizes the voluntary nature of this contribution. The Greek there indicates a voluntary contribution. We also saw that in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians. We'll see it again in chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians. The Greek means to share in. It's a fellowship or participation. And the Greek stresses that with the language that it uses. So Paul recognizes that there is an obligation, so to speak, to provide financial support through money, to give material aid and support. But now he's added this other factor, that they're sharing in spiritual blessings as well as financial and economic blessings. So in a sense, the Gentiles have a moral obligation because of shared spiritual blessings to contribute to this contribution. So see, it kind of goes a little different than going out doing United Way collections. Anybody ever done that? I know, Rita, you probably have. I have. It's not particularly fun, but anyway, that's an aside. So contextually, we begin to fill in some gaps. We begin to have the ability to make some greater sense of what's going on in these texts that talks about these contributions. So if we look at these other factors rather than just financial or economic support, this collection is not only charity, but a theological statement of equality between the two between the two groups. And it carries a different, not only quantitative, but qualitative sense to why Paul is doing this. Okay, thoughts, questions, comments? Does that help in any way? Maybe not. So, does not establish a direct timeline, but for me at least, it begins to help understand some of why he puts so much effort into this. So, okay, anything else? Thoughts, questions? Last call. That's a whole nother lifestyle. I'm giving you back about 10 minutes. We'll assemble upstairs in a little bit. Oh, next week we'll actually dig into these first 5 verses